I was doing the testing with.
Really? Yeah, because I had him yesterday.
Yeah,
He's like out of Prague, and I had like all the notes in my notebook, and like when I saw that on your LinkedIn today, when I was like getting ready for the podcast, I was like, I have to talk to you about like this like whole parabolic space flight, the Vomit Comet in France,
yeah,
and like the whole shifting Pilates thing they're doing with the levels, so it decreases like the penetrating force essentially, like it would. You can talk about it better.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so during this parabolic flight campaign, we were testing this exercise device, which the easiest way of describing it is it looks like a Pilates reformer made out of aluminium. So the two carriages slide back and forth. That minimises any vibration that you get from it. In fact, there was a para astronaut running on a treadmill next to us. And we had to stop doing some of our testing because him running on the treadmill was creating too much vibration for our testing to be appropriate at certain times. So that minimizes the level of vibration with the way that they've designed it, which is brilliant. Um, but what NASA and the space agencies really want is a device which allows you to do resistance exercise for hypertrophy and strength, so moderate and high load, impact exercises to help with bone mineral density, so more plyometric type tasks. And they also want the device able to do aerobic exercise at the same time. So, we got on this parabolic flight. We had an astronaut and an athlete as our participants, or reserve astronaut. She's not gone into space yet, but she's hoping to very soon. And they were the participants. They were in an XN suit, which has accelerometers, etc., built into them, so we could look at the different joint angles, angular velocities, and every aspect of how they were moving. EMG to look at muscle activation patterns, heart rate monitors on them at times. We had force plates built into this device so that we can get the ground reaction forces and the impact forces. So I don't think I've ever collected so much data in one sort of testing session as we managed to collect on the parabolic flight. And I've certainly never done it when you're in simulated microgravity. And the interesting thing is, before you go into simulated microgravity and when you come out of it, you're hitting 2Gs as well. So you're lifting your hand up to try and press a button on the keyboard, and your arm weighs twice the amount that it normally weighs. So that's a very interesting experience. And I'll be honest, I didn't think the device would do everything that we needed it to do. I thought there'd be a few limitations, but it actually works really well. There's a few modifications that they're going to try and make to it to improve it even further, because what we didn't know with some of it is exactly how it would work in the simulated microgravity. We can only make certain assumptions based on how you move on Earth with 1G, and suddenly you go into simulated microgravity and you do an action like rowing like you would on an erg, and because gravity is not pushing you down into the seat, you start floating up into the air, which is really interesting to see. And you're only fixed by your feet. So what you need to do is then make sure that they can't continue to raise up and damage their ankles in any way. But yeah, it was a very, very interesting experience. Professor Dan Cleather is still working on analysing all the data. In fact, he messaged me yesterday about it because we had such a huge volume of data. And they had to analyse it to answer certain questions and certain priorities first. And I'm pretty certain there's another parabolic flight scheduled for later on this year based on the modifications that they've made for the device.
He was saying you're all going up in April again.
Yes, yeah.
What is it? I was trying to like one of the things that we touched upon when I spoke with him was I love the idea of like what is it, the first law of thermodynamics: energy cannot be created or destroyed; it's just transferred. And talking about these vibrational forces, he was saying that something like 900 kilos, which is about 2,000 pounds, of force is being transmitted if someone were to like run on a treadmill on the ISS, which they currently do, in order to just
Yeah.
maintain some semblance of cardiovascular and musculoskeletal function. Is there a way to transmit that kinetic energy and even thermal energy back into usable energy for the ISS? Because I know he was trying to cancel out the energy through what was it,
Yeah.
Newton's third law, which is like the equal but opposite law. And the way that he
Yeah.
explained it was really well. So I was like, is there a way to just transfer it as opposed to like canceling it out?
There must be, but the problem they have is the first time they put a treadmill on the International Space Station, they didn't have a vibration isolation system. So the vibration is enough that you're in a vacuum. It's only, might only be a small amount of force, but that can move the space station out of orbit. or into a different orbit. So, the vibration is quite substantial. And you think if you've got that amount of force, every single foot strike, that can create a lot of motion and a lot of inertia occurring. So the key thing there is that there must be a way of doing that within that vibration isolation system. There's a damping system in there, but could that be used to create energy? You probably need to get an exceptionally good engineer to do that. But then again, if they could do that, electric cars would self-charge themselves perfectly all the time and would never need charging up again, would they?
So how are the kinks being worked out per se? Like when he was explaining yesterday, he was talking about like the flight on like the Vomit Comet being like about 2.5 hours, and you're basically just going in sine waves the entire time, and you go 2G, 1G, 0G, 1G, 2G, 0G the entire time. Yeah. Is there equal, I guess, efficacy of this certain exercise device when you're at one of the peaks as well as one of the valleys on that sine wave with the amplitudes?
It works really well both in 1G and in simulated 0G. You're not actually allowed to test any of the equipment when you're in 2G. They advise you not to, because in that situation, that's when people start feeling nauseous with the compression. Simple things like if somebody says something and you quickly turn your head to look at them in 2G, that just makes you feel really weird. So you're not actually allowed to do the testing in that environment. But the good thing is, the device has a huge amount of potential for rehabilitation on Earth, as well as being able to, the potential for being used in 0G. And also, the plan for NASA is to actually put a base on the moon as well. So then you'll be at 1/6 of gravity. So you're still going to need exercise and activity which will help to prevent that loss of muscle mass, muscle strength, and bone density when you'd be in a 6th gravity. And that would even be the same, if Elon Musk does have his plan and make it to Mars and colonize Mars, that's 60% of the gravity of what we've got on Earth. So if you wanted to come back, you've got to do some pretty intense training while you're on Mars and on the return journey from Mars to make sure that you can come back and you can still function on Earth. So yeah, it's very interesting in the way that the device works. And the other thing to consider is because it has a spring mass in there, the more force you don't necessarily need a higher mass, because the more force you apply to a spring, the further they separate apart. That means it returns with far more energy because you stretch the springs further. So by the time you come back, the mass isn't any higher, but the velocity coming back is higher. So if your velocity is higher and your mass is the same, you've got a higher momentum. So you then have to generate a much higher impulse, byproduct of a higher force, to decelerate yourself and then re-accelerate to jump again, if it's a jumping task you're doing. So it's almost become self-regulating. You don't need a huge amount of resistance or anything, because you create that resistance with a spring mass, which is really quite interesting to see how it works and to see how it feels even in 1G when I've played around on the device. It gives you a hell of a workout. Unfortunately, I didn't get to try it in simulated microgravity because we had to focus on the experiments, not me playing.
Stop playing around. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dan was telling me that you only need something like, was it 30 to 50 jumps per day or something like that, and to land on stiff legs in order to maintain bone density in 0G or 1G or be a microgravity.
Yeah, there's a study by NASA where they looked at regular, frequent impact type activities, and it's only a low volume of high impact activities that's required. Now, I think the issue there is you've got to make sure you're doing that regularly. If you went up into space and didn't do it for the first few months and then started doing it, you've already got a reduction in bone density, which could be problematic. It'd almost be like getting somebody with osteoporosis to start doing high impact jumping tasks. Something's going to fracture. So you need to do it from the start. But the other thing that you need to consider with some of those tasks is your spine lengthens when you're in microgravity. So if you're in permanent microgravity on the space station, because gravity doesn't compress you, your spine lengthens. It also changes the fluid dynamics in your body, so your discs hydrate and swell up slightly, which also makes you basically taller. But that means that the loading on the spine is absorbed in a completely different way. So you really need to get up there and start loading almost instantly to make sure you maintain that protective effect, and all the musculature around the spine will cope with that. So yeah, there's a series of other challenges that you don't necessarily think of, and whether what we don't know is whether the body can cope appropriately with that in space. There's a really high incidence of spinal problems when people come back to Earth from being in space because they've had that lengthening, then they suddenly have a shortening of the spine and a change in the hydration status of the discs. So quite a few people end up with prolapsed discs in different injuries is to the discs in the spine. So and that's not caused by the exercise. That's just the changes that happen. So are there extra things we can do with exercise to try and offset some of those problems when people return to Earth?
Yeah, he was saying that there's something with respect to, and what you were touching upon, the fluid dynamics, such that I think he was talking about like the jugular vein or something, or maybe like the middle cerebral artery, where blood flow is essentially like very much slowed and almost like stops to a certain extent. And like that could have huge risk with respect to like stroke, pulmonary embolism, where like the flow is not going correctly. So would you do that with respect with maybe total peripheral resistance? Would you need to add like a stocking or like a strong suit to suck up, or to push the blood flow back from the legs up to the head just to circulate it quicker?
Yeah, it's really interesting because initially when astronauts are in space, you tend to get a real sort of puffiness in their face because that blood flow has completely changed. Gravity isn't pushing everything down, which you don't think of normally. The fact that happens and it has to fight to push it back up, it flows much more easily. But after I can't remember the duration. I think it's about 6 to 8 weeks. All of that starts to subside because the body tends to then adapt to, the amount of pressure it needs to generate with each heartbeat and the peripheral resistance and the arterial walls, etc. So the body does then start to adapt. Whether you need something in between that to assist, or whether that would hinder that adaptation process, who knows? The interesting thing will be is because that does affect it. If you were going on a mission to Mars or somewhere, and that's going to take you over 12 months. Most people haven't spent 12 months or longer in space. And if you're spending 12 months or longer to get to Mars, then you get to Mars and you're at 60% of the Earth's gravity. You have to function, do a mission for 6 months or however long, and then come back. You keep getting all those different changes in pressure. And, then you need to consider how that would affect blood flow, how even things like your vision, it changes. Because there's less compression on the eyeball, and therefore the shape of the lens, etc., can alter, and people can get blurred vision for a period of time. Once you really start looking at it, it's unbelievable how much gravity has an effect on our body, and all the different systems of the body, and then how different that is when people go into that microgravity environment. So yeah, there's a huge amount of factors to think of. And people have discussed simple things like a lot of people get kidney stones when they're on the International Space Station for an extended period of time. So people have questioned, should they be using things like calcium and vitamin D supplements? But actually, you're likely to be getting the kidney stones, not because of the supplementation, but because the breakdown of the bones is so rapid. So what we need to do is offset that breakdown of the bones and the release of calcium. Rather than say, well, let's not give them a calcium supplement. That's almost essential. But that only works if they've got the appropriate loading on the skeletal system for the appropriate absorption and resorption of the bone. I'm not an expert in that area, but once you start looking, it becomes more and more complex, and you have to really start thinking about how all the different body systems interact and function in that completely different environment, which, like I said, each time people will go up to the International Space Station, it's 4 or 5 people at a time. So you're only getting small amounts of information over the last 25 years. And now we're getting to that point where there's enough information, if we go back and do the retrospective analysis of that data, to really try and identify what might be causing some of the issues we're seeing and the potential things we can change to improve those situations. And then if NASA do put a base on the moon and you end up with a lot more people in space on the what will replace the International Space Station, the Gateway Space Station, and on the moon itself, and then in the future, possibly even Mars, suddenly we'll be able the research will develop and evolve rapidly because there's a lot more people there. Whereas if you're dealing with a few people at a time, you're dealing with individual case studies. And as we know, when you do anything in sports science and strength and conditioning, every individual adapts in a completely different way. So yeah, that makes it a little bit trickier.
Are you familiar with the Kelly brothers, the
Yes.
astronauts? Like I think Scott Kelly and his brother. I think they also went to Rutgers. I went to Rutgers up in New Jersey.
Yeah.
But one of them, I think Scott Kelly might be like a little bit taller than his twin brother and a little bit like younger from like the theory of relativity because he spent so much time up in space. And in his book Endure, like he talked about just like the really awful physiological and almost like psychological issues that happened when he came down after like 11 months or 12 or 13 months of just like vestibular issues, musculoskeletal issues, proprioceptive issues. And I was like, man, like what are maybe like the top three most pressing issues? I think about that too when you had said like the shape of the eye changes. Like I've had two retinal tears because like one of my eyes is shaped almost like a football. So like the back of the eye is being stretched out. Optic nerve detaches from the retina. It could cause like a retinal detachment. I'm like, well, I can't go up into space, even if I was like offered the opportunity to. But I'm like, that seems like an issue is like the vision, the musculoskeletal wise is an issue, the cardiovascular wise. I used to study orthostatic intolerance in grad school. That's a huge thing too, is orthostasis. So I'm like, are there any like three big pressing issues which limit the amount of time and space besides the physics involved of like reaching escape velocity and getting out to Mars and coming back? Because that's a whole other thing with planetary motion.
Yeah. A lot of it really depends on what people are doing while they're in space and what activity they're doing. Because you get some people come back with a dramatic deterioration, over 30% loss in muscle strength. And that's anything from 90 days to a year in space. 30% decrease in muscle strength, and in some cases slightly greater. That's substantial. That's problematic. But there have been a handful of people that have come back from space with a higher muscle strength level. And what we need to do is identify why. So luckily I've got access, so I'm waiting for the data to be sent to me. I put in a data request to the Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health to get the data to try and answer some of those questions for muscle strength, muscle mass, aerobic capacity, and bone density. And that gives us everyone that's been on the International Space Station for over 90 days in the last 25 years, as long as they consent to us using the data for those purposes. So it varies dramatically, and that for some people it might be a big reduction in aerobic capacity. Other people it's strength. Other people it's bone mineral density. But then we also need to identify, is that debilitating when they come back to Earth? One of the things that most people struggle with, and it's really difficult to figure out how you could address this, is the proprioceptive aspect. Because you're floating around, all your proprioceptive organs and all the surfaces you normally be in contact with when you're standing trying to balance, you get no stimulus for that. So how do you recreate a stimulus like that? That's really, really difficult. And to do it regularly enough to maintain that sort of function. So that does make it really tricky. But again, if you add that to the vestibular aspect and put all of that together, some people find it really, really tough when they return to Earth. Others don't find it much of a problem. But also you can look at that in terms of when submariners come back from extended periods undersea. They come back and they're not allowed to drive for a certain amount of time because they've only ever seen, probably 15 feet in front of them. So their ability for depth perception is completely changed. And that's probably a similar issue you get in the International Space Station because you're only seeing short distances. But then if you look out of one of the windows, you're then looking however many kilometers it is back down to Earth. So then your depth perception completely changes. So a lot of it really does depend on what changes and what deteriorates in that individual. And that's the thing, is we haven't got enough data in some of those areas. And there's a lot more in terms of the technology that people working with the vestibular aspects and the proprioception, where they're trying to use virtual reality and other things to try and simulate what things might be like on Earth. But again, then, how realistic can you make some of those things? And then you've got to think about the mass of everything that goes up into space is quite expensive. And then you've got to maintain it, you've got to power it. So, there's so many different issues that you need to think about. But I would say that something like the vision and the proprioception when you first come back to Earth is something that affects everyone, but it's very, very individual.
Yeah, I kind of wonder, it's when you had said you'd kind of given those statistics on how quickly aerobic capacity can drop and muscular strength and hypertrophy can drop, as well as, um, bone mineral density. And I thought about it from the standpoint of how quickly, like if someone's ever put on a ventilator for like, I don't know, COVID or emphysema or COPD or
Yep.
something, and the diaphragm starts to like severely atrophy in like the first 2 weeks. And I think about that from the standpoint of when Dan said that astronauts can exercise upwards of 25% of their working day. And I was like, is there a way to curb this such that like they always talk about like a pill for exercise. Like right now we have all the GLP-1 agonists, which is basically like you don't
Yep.
need to diet, just shoot yourself up with this and you won't have to eat anything. I'm like, is there a way to do that with respect for exercise so that these astronauts can be more efficient, healthy for a longer period of time and not waste so many calories and energy just exercising? And I don't even know, because I know like SpaceX was talking about having like a loaded suit which is just heavier to carry around. So it's like, okay, it's almost like a weighted vest, but it's an entire weighted
Yep.
body. Maybe weighting your body could help, but I don't know.
Yeah, and again, with that, how do you weight it when you're in zero gravity on a space station or a spacecraft traveling somewhere? You can't, because it doesn't weigh anything. You're in a vacuum. You almost got to go back to some of those old sci-fi movies where they create artificial gravity on something. You've got two wheels going in opposite directions to create that centrifugal force. The suits planned for return to the lunar surface for the Artemis missions are pretty heavy. I think they're in the region of about 100 kilos, with all the equipment in there and the big plate that goes on the back for the rebreathing system and etc. to go on there. But again, you think 100 kilos, why? That's a lot. Well, not if it's only 1/6 gravity. It's now 1/6 of 100 kilos, so it's not a lot. But the other thing that you don't think of is the suits are pressurized, and this and the pressurization of the suits is quite high. So just flexing the elbow or extending the elbow requires force. But that's only if you're then in that suit, which is if they do an extravehicular activity, so a spacewalk. And actually, what we don't know is how demanding the task will be when people return back to the lunar surface, because adding mass to it or adding pressure to it might help with, bone mineral density, muscle mass, muscle strength. But then it's also going to mean it's far more fatiguing to complete your mission. So you have to have a real trade-off. And they've only got data from when, the previous Apollo missions, when people went to the moon. And that's old data. And it's you could take an average of, well, what was their carbon dioxide output and their oxygen uptake during a period of time. But it doesn't tell you how demanding each individual task is. It's a different suit. It's, so there's so many different things to factor in. And what there seems to be is all of the different things that you could do to offset some of those changes. It might help one thing. So, if you use blood flow restriction, great, it's going to help offset a decrease in muscle mass, which will slow down the decline in muscle strength. It might not necessarily preserve muscle strength. But then we're not applying the same forces through the skeletal system. So is that going to have any effect on the bone density and bone strength, or will that still deteriorate in the same way? We don't know. So you might address the muscle mass and strength, but your bone density still decreases. And what it seems is each time you sort of look at some of these solutions, oh, well, this might be a good option. Back in the really early missions, the shuttle missions and before that, they tried a whole range of different pressurized suits, weighted devices, etc. And none of them were anywhere near as successful as they really needed to be. And now some of it, I think you've got to go back to that and go, well, why? What was the technology at the time? Was there something that wasn't understood? Could that be improved? But ultimately, again, I think even if you give, they use anti-resorptive drugs for bone mineral density. That's had a massive improvement on the reductions in bone mineral density that occur, but it hasn't resolved it. All of these things seem to, you've got to look at it holistically. Some drug therapy might work, improving dietary intake might work, adding in the right exercise. But there's a really nice study from NASA, the Sprint study, where they looked at doing much higher intensity, shorter bouts of activity, whether it was resistance exercise, more plyometric type motions, and also doing higher intensity interval type training rather than prolonged exercise, which reduced down the amount of time that they needed to perform exercise in a day. And it was equally as effective as the normal recommendations. So that's great. We can condense down the amount of time, whereas people previously might have thought, well, I've only got 90 minutes now, there's no point. I need to do 2.5 hours. Actually, that study shows that the astronauts, even if they did 45 minutes, it's better than not doing anything. So, we just need to find those more efficient ways of doing certain things. But again, the issue you have with the higher intensity exercise is those changes to things like the spinal structure, the fluid balance, which is going to affect, synovial fluid, etc., within your joints as well. And, how well can people cope with some of those things? But we can't simulate that with Earth-based studies for some of it either. There's no way of doing that because you don't get the same adaptation in the joints or in the spine, etc., as you do once you're in microgravity. So it makes it really difficult.
What's the most pressing goal right now, I guess, for NASA? Is it to get to Mars, or is it to first set up that one, I guess, roving space station, which is going to orbit the moon, land on the moon, use that as a touch point to touch off and go to Mars? I don't know the distance from here to Mars or from the moon to Mars, but I understand it's going to take quite a while. And
yep.
If you think about it from the perspective of inertia, the goal is to get into inertia within space, but you have to reach escape velocity first. It's probably easier to get out of the moon's orbit than the Earth's orbit because the moon is so much smaller, so the gravitational pull is less. Is that kind of the goal right now, to get up to the moon, orbit it, touch down, boom, then get to Mars and then come back to the moon?
Yeah, it depends on who you listen to. So you've got the different space agencies all have slightly different goals and slightly different theories. Elon Musk doesn't think you need to go to the moon. If you listen to some of the stuff on the SpaceX website, he describes it as almost being like Battlestar Galactica, having a load of the starships just literally orbiting the Earth, and then once there's enough of them, you've got critical mass to send people and the infrastructure that can be up there to almost colonize it immediately is to then send 100 or so starships straight to the moon. And you can get them orbiting around the Earth so they pick up a high velocity and that slingshots them off. Whereas one of the theories is, as you've just described, escape velocity from the moon is much lower. It will require much less fuel. So if you have a base on the moon and then can launch from the moon, that might be an even better option. But then you can't get the same slingshot effect around the moon as you would do around Earth. So I think you'll probably find that what will happen is people will try different ways. Certainly to go down to the moon and back up, NASA seem to have the priority of having the Gateway space station there so you can dock with that, then drop down. But again, if you look at Elon Musk's starships that they're proposing for the moon, they should be able to land vertically on the moon and then take off as long as they can carry enough fuel to do that. But as you've just described, there's far less gravitational pull, therefore the escape velocity is much lower, so they wouldn't need a huge amount of fuel to be able to do that. But on the SpaceX website, they've got images of two starships almost going belly to belly, docking and refueling. So you could get out of the Earth's atmosphere, refuel, and then drop that starship back down onto the moon. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how these things do happen. And what the real solution is, because at the moment a lot of it is hypothetical. It's very, very good, engineering and modeling that people have done to come up with these ideas. But until they actually do it, we don't know which is going to be the best approach.
Yeah. Do you know I don't know, this might be an unfair or loaded question, but do you know the time course at which NASA, SpaceX, and Blue Origin and some of these other companies are trying to look at? Is it within the next 1, 5, 10 plus years?
Well, it depends on exactly what the goal is. The goal at the moment is really to replace the International Space Station and have a Gateway space station orbiting the moon around about 2030. So we're looking at about four to 5 years from now, which is pretty scary. That's quick. And if you go onto any of their websites, it gives you the sort of the company's plan. But if you go onto the NASA website, it will give you their overall plan. And obviously, some of that will be dictated by how quickly SpaceX, Blue Origin, Orbital Reef, all these other organizations develop their technology and get the proof of concept, and then the approval to launch the different rockets at different stages, etc. But yeah, you're looking really at about the next 5 years to be able to get into that position. You've got Artemis 2 taking off within the next month, I think it is. And then by Artemis 4, they're planning to land back on the moon, but with the NASA's own rocket. And then pretty much after that, I think Elon Musk and SpaceX have been given the backing by NASA to then do all the future missions, because the rocket's reusable and will cost far less money than it would be to have a non-reusable rocket. But again, if you listen to watch some of the stuff on any of those individual organizations, Blue Origin, SpaceX, whoever it might be, they have slightly different timelines for certain things. They've talked about not just having a replacement for the International Space Station, but launching their own space stations anyway, and having hotels and those sorts of things up there, and having laboratories up in space where science that is difficult to perform in 1G could be performed in 0G. So yeah, actually, when you look at that, there's the priorities of the different space agencies and the government agencies, but then there's the priorities of those individual organizations that are really starting to develop far more rapidly. So it's going to be a great thing to watch over the next 5 to 10 years. And then I don't know whether you've followed any of what China have been doing. They've now, over the weekend, launched. So they've got their own space station now, and they've also released details of their suit that they're going to use to try and put people on the moon. So it's almost like a space race again, but it's going to be, almost the US and everyone working with the US and China rather than the US and Russia. But again, it's all good, really, because it will accelerate that progress.
What is China hoping to do? Have they been successful in launching rockets, getting astronauts into space? Like, I know, like, the story of the whole, America, Russia, and that was around like the bicentennial, and like they cut funding for many, many years. But where does China stack up with that?
Yeah, so China have managed to be successful with the rockets, and now they're planning. They haven't released much information, but they're planning to try and put people on the moon around similar timeframes to what NASA and the other space agencies have suggested. So yeah, it'll definitely be one to watch, and it'll be really interesting, because I think the more there is that push from different organisations, whether it's commercial or different countries, the more that this stuff is going to develop in terms of the technology, but also in terms of the research to be able to say, well, what's the healthiest way to do it? What's the healthiest and safest way for those individuals?
Did you ever see the Cosmos series with either Carl Sagan or Neil deGrasse Tyson?
Yes.
I love the Neil deGrasse Tyson ones. Like I've probably seen all of those episodes like 2 or 3 times. Every time I go on a flight out to like California or something, I like 6 hours to kill. I'm like, all right, we're going through them again. And one thing that's I think is like really interesting is physicists, astrophysicists, mathematicians, whomever, like they've figured out planetary motion. They've gotten Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 blasting out, trying to get beyond the Oort cloud. And they understand how to get to the moon relative to where the moon is orbiting the Earth and where they are relative orbiting the sun, all different stuff. But one thing that he pointed out in one of the episodes is that he had like, if this like right here, like the microphone head was like the Earth. And he was like, you know how far, if this was like a globe, he's like, you know how far like human beings have gotten from the Earth? It's like 3 centimeters. And it's like the entire auditorium that he was standing in is like the entire, like, just our solar system, not the Milky Way galaxy, just the solar system. He goes, we've only gotten like right here. And we're talking about like all the implications of having that. And it's like, how far could the advancement in space travel have been if funding hadn't been cut for so long and people maybe stopped like watching so much football or something? And I love football, but
yeah, and it is really interesting because I know that during that initial space race, there were loads of other things where people were drawn to, we need to invest more money here, we need to invest it here. But there's lots of things actually people don't realize about, the technological advances that came with with space exploration. Simple things like cordless power tools. They were developed purely so that they could repair parts of the International Space Station, because you can't. Where do you plug in when you're floating around outside the space station? So you have to have a power tool which will allow you to do those sorts of tasks. The improved communication, things like Bluetooth technology and those sorts of things, a lot of them have been developed with, trying to solve problems for being in space. So as much as some people say, well, but it costs, billions and billions, it does. But actually, there's lots of stuff that comes out of it that has, probably improved our everything we do in daily life that you don't even think about. And then, just the technological developments now, if you think about it, they've said that, the Apollo 11 mission, the spacecraft had less power than you would have in a normal scientific calculator. Most people don't have a scientific calculator now. They do it on their phone. So the technology that we have and the ability to be able to do these things, when the astronauts used to fly, they were normally all test pilots. And they could make all the calculations themselves. They were some of the smartest people around. If something went wrong, they had to figure it out. Now it's done by computer. They're not piloting those craft the majority of the time. There's the potential for them to take over. Most of it's done automatically. And then if you think about then how that works, technology in cars now, self-driving vehicles. Not that I would personally trust a self-driving vehicle, but if you can get a rocket to launch, dock with the International Space Station, come back down to Earth, and it can do that, and it can land really precisely, that's really beneficial technology that we will see grow and develop on Earth, which is, again, it's things that are really interesting. I've been the last 2 years to the SHOP conference, Spaceflight Performance in Human Exploration, based out at the Houston Space Center, organized by Corey Twine. And it's fantastic. And when you get the astronauts and other people talking about the developments, their experiences while they're on the space station, and some of the things that have developed, their backgrounds and where they've come from, some of the technology companies explaining how the problems of what they're having to try and do and they try and develop. It's fascinating. It's so much bigger than you could possibly imagine. But getting those insights from the astronauts that have been up there, even simple things like, that the pressure in the spacesuits. A lot of astronauts will delaminate their fingers. They lose their fingernails because you've got a pressurized glove, and then there are seams around the top of the gloves. So as you do this with your hand, your fingernails can just keep rubbing on the seam. And after a few hours of doing whatever you're doing on a spacewalk, you come back and lots of them lose fingernails. But why has that not been resolved? It has been with the new suits that are used on the Dragon flights. But then the other suits that some of them have been using are still pretty much modified versions of what was used in the Apollo missions. And there was actually quite a heated debate amongst some of the astronauts and some of the NASA staff at one of those conferences over why they've spent X amount of money on certain things, but they've not resolved those problems, and they should be easy to resolve. So, but yeah, it's such an interesting experience to go to some of those conferences because it's every single aspect of human health and performance. And then what you don't think about is they're basically almost in what would be the life support system. That entire spacesuit is a life support system. So that's the priority. Can we keep you alive? If you lose a fingernail, who cares? They do care, but obviously that's low priority compared to can you keep breathing for an extended period of time if you're out in the vacuum of space.
There was that one, I forget his name, but there was like some astronaut who became like untethered on a spacewalk. And it was like this point of like, do you panic? Well, no, that's not the good thing. But like inertia, you're just going to keep going and going and going and going. And it's like, so what do you do? And I don't know what the answer was to like how he got back, but that becomes a concern as well. And it's like, even with the fingernail thing, these are things that you don't really think about.
Yeah. One of the astronauts at the conference last year gave a really good presentation and summary of some of their training. So they have this huge swimming pool, biggest swimming pool in the world, and it's got a life-size model of the International Space Station submerged in it. So they basically go into what looks like a spacesuit, but it's, they're diving. And they'll practice everything they need to do before they go into space. And what normally happens is you go out of an airlock feet first. So you go out of an airlock feet first, and as you move out, you see the International Space Station. That's your perspective. That's fine. If you go out head first, you see the concrete side of the swimming pool. And the one astronaut said that on one of the occasions, because of something he had to do, it was much better for him to go out head first. So he opened the hatch, starts going out space for head first, and had somebody else quickly speak to him on the radio, say, "Is everything okay? You know, all your vitals have spiked." And he said, from that perspective, all he could see was blackness and the earth below him, and he just had this sense that he would fall, even though he's holding on and he's tethered. But you just and he said because he's never had that perspective when they've been actually replicating that in this huge swimming pool that they've got, because there's the wall in front of you, or the floor of the swimming pool. Whereas that was something he was not prepared for. Going out feet first and slowly seeing the space station was exactly what he'd practiced. It didn't really spike his vitals too much. But again, even with some of those things, you know, the energy expenditure, I can't remember what it is now, but it's a ridiculously high energy expenditure when they're out doing spacewalk, those extravehicular activities, because even though you're floating, there's fear, so you've got adrenaline, intense concentration on what you're doing, the fact that you have to flex and extend your joints against the pressure within the spacesuit, and they're just things that you wouldn't think about unless you had somebody, you know, who's been there and done it, explaining it all to you. Which again then makes you think, well, I've heard people say, well, do you just let people deteriorate while they're out there and rehabilitate them when they come back? And then you don't have to use 2.5 hours a day for exercise. Well, they still need to maintain a certain level of strength, aerobic capacity for all the mission priorities. Otherwise, they're going to be struggling with those sorts of activities. So, you know, and it's a really interesting dilemma when you start listening to them. But also some of the astronauts, there was one, I can't remember his name now, it was an Italian astronaut who said the first time he went into space and went to the International Space Station, he followed the general recommendations for exercise, came back and found everything really hard. So the next time he went back up to the International Space Station, he decided he'd work even harder. But was worried that, you know, would he recover? Is that going to affect his ability during any of the missions and the stuff they have to do on a day-to-day basis? But then said, actually, he recovered ridiculously quickly, because if we go to the gym and exercise for 2 hours now, you've still got gravity affecting you. You've still got to, you know, walk around and do your activities of daily living. They float for the rest of the time. So actually, you know, some of the astronauts were saying that you recover so much quicker from that type of exercise than you would on Earth. So you can easily up the intensities or the volumes. But again, I think that it's one of those things where the individual aspect then, if you love exercise and you're told you've got 2.5 hours a day to set up the equipment, get cleaned up afterwards and everything else, but this is what you do, 2.5 hours a day dedicated towards that. I'd love that in my job. If I could go into the university and spend 2.5 hours a day, that'd be fantastic. It's not going to happen. But not everybody would love that. So not everybody will exercise the intensities or the frequency that they're probably meant to. And that's what the data we've got access to, or will get access to now, will be really interesting, because we can start looking and saying, well, is it the frequency, the volume, the intensity of exercise that has all these protective benefits? Is it something different? Is it the pre-flight status, etc.? You know, what is it that really means some astronauts come back in a similar state to when they leave, and others come back with, you know, quite a debilitated state.
Well, that was one of the themes around what I wanted to ask you today before we started talking about all like this cool space stuff. Was like, there's no shortage of people on the internet talking scientifically and then unscientifically about minimum effective volume and maximal recoverable volume, maybe just in the hypertrophy space, strength space, even endurance sports too. And I think that point that you just touched upon with, you can recover so much quicker in space because you're not quite literally weighed down by the gravity that you have here on Earth. Do these insights lend well to what the minimum effective volume could be on Earth for like an aging population? Because like for aging folks, like they're going to need more activity. But as you said, with the osteoporosis, you can't have a 79-year-old woman doing depth jumps, because there goes her pelvis and both femurs and both tibias.
Yeah. Well, I think the key thing is with this, is we've got to go back to a few key principles. One is progressive overload. If you've not done any exercise for 10 years, anything is going to be beneficial and create overload. And that could be a frail older individual that can be standing up from the chair is near maximal effort. Do that 4 or 5 times and then go about whatever you're going to do. Go and make yourself a tea or a coffee, come back, sit down. Next time, instead of standing up once, stand up 5 or 6 times. And if that's a near maximal effort and you're doing, 4, 5, 6 repetitions, that's strength training. And some of those older individuals can't do hypertrophy because they couldn't do the higher repetition ranges. Now, I know, you can get a hypertrophic effect from high intensity, low volume, right the way through to low intensity and much higher volumes. But we know there is a sweet spot. So I think we've got to think about progressive overload, and it has to be individualized for that person. So if you've got a really good training history, we've got to beat you up a little bit to get an adaptive response. If you've got minimal training history or you've done nothing for the last few years, it's really easy to get you to adapt. You work with low-level athletes, and you look like a god as a strength coach because everyone improves dramatically. You work with the most elite athletes, and trying to get a tiny improvement is really, really difficult. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to scale it based on that person's ability, training history, and their physical capability at that point. But then in terms of recovery, it's, well, what are we recovering from? Are we looking at the adaptations in the muscle? Are we looking at recovery in terms of you have to rehydrate after aerobic exercise? That should be quite quick and easy. You have to replenish your energy substrates. So if you've depleted glycogen from lots of aerobic exercise, we need a really high carbohydrate diet. Your muscles could have recovered, but what if you're still depleted? So we see this in soccer in the UK quite a lot. Everyone obsesses over recovery strategies. You cover 10 to 12 kilometers in a game in 90 minutes. Well, that's a fast walk. That's not intense. Now, obviously, that's lots of high intensity acceleration, deceleration, etc. But recovering from that, in terms of your muscular system, if you're fit and strong, that shouldn't take much. You shouldn't be sore for days afterwards. If you're sore for days afterwards, you weren't appropriately conditioned to play the sport in the first place, which is the state of the muscular system in most soccer players, to be honest with you, certainly in the UK and Europe. Aerobically, they're phenomenal. They can go on and on and on. Strength, power, hypertrophy is limited. But then they'll obsess over how do we stop that, the soreness and the problems that 24, 48 hours afterwards. Well, if you get them stronger in the first place, then they won't be as fatigued, or the muscles won't have taken as much muscle damage. But even if we go through those recovery strategies that people will use, ice baths, contrast bathing, higher protein intakes, etc., your muscular system might have recovered in terms of any muscle damage. But if you haven't eaten sufficient carbohydrate and then you try and compete for 90 minutes, you might get 45 minutes in and that's it. You're done. You've run out of carbohydrate. So again, we have to think about it from that holistic and that much bigger perspective. And that's why then looking at the intensity of exercise and also the volume needs to be considered. Because if we do high volumes, you're going to deplete your energy substrates. But you could do very high intensity exercise, which doesn't deplete the energy substrates to the same extent and will allow much more rapid recovery, depending on what your training goals are at that point. The other issue that we then have in terms of things like the minimum effective dose is minimum effective dose to achieve what? Is it just to maintain? So that should be the minimum maintenance dose. And if it's the minimum effective dose, you're trying to achieve how much of an adaptation over what period of time? And again, then we have to come back to training status. If I'm not well trained, I could get a big improvement in performance over a short duration. If I'm a really elite athlete, you're not going to get a big adaptation. But we also need to consider that in terms of what adaptive processes we're after. If you go back to the example I gave of soccer players, aerobic capacity is generally pretty high in most of them. Yes, it can be improved. There's a series of studies showing high intensity interval training. You can improve, 10% within 10 to 12 weeks, which is great if you've already got a really high aerobic capacity. But that's still relatively small in terms of the adaptations. I've worked with soccer players in the past where, we can almost double their strength levels within 10 weeks. Now that sounds crazy, but that's because they've just learnt the skill. They've never done any resistance training before. You get them squatting, they can only use a moderate load, technique's not good, they've just got more skillful at squatting. It's not a true increase in strength. But if we still use something like an isometric knee extension, knee flexion type task, which doesn't have that skill level, you still then see within that time frame notable improvements in strength. But we've got to build it up progressively. And whether it's an athlete you're working with or whether it's a frail older individual, if you push them too hard too early and they come back with delayed onset muscle soreness, what's the first thing they think? They're injured. And that puts them off for exercising. And whether that's because they feel they can't compete because they're injured or they're sore, or whether it's just that, that if you're frail and you're older, I would imagine, I'm older, but I'm not frail at the moment. It will come at some point. But, in that situation, if you've not really done any habitual exercise and we get somebody to do some squatting type movements and their glutes and their lower back are tight the next day, they're going to think they've injured their back. They're not going to come back and do another training session. So we might not have the optimal or the maximal recoverable dose, but as long as we go back to that progressive overload and each week or each session, depending on how quickly we want them to progress, we create a small amount of overload, a few extra kilograms lifted, an extra repetition per set or an extra set. Obviously, we can only incrementally increase each of those because you'll end up doing 20 sets otherwise, and you haven't got time to do that. So then we need to go, okay, let's up the intensity. But we can manipulate those variables easily, but it needs to be progressive. And as long as you add progressive overload, people improve. The more rapid you create that overload, the more rapidly they improve, depending on their ability to recover.
Does that lend support to then going up into a space, or is that just a completely different conversation of just mitigating muscle protein breakdown?
I think as far as we can tell at the moment, yeah, it does apply in space. The recovery processes are slightly different. You have all the other constraints over, when they go up to when they do the next Artemis mission in about a month's time. They're in this tiny little capsule, the Orion capsule. There's going to be 4 or 5 people in there, and that's about all there's space for. And they've got a flywheel device for exercise. But you've also got to think about the life support system. If you start doing really high intensity aerobic exercise, can that cope with the life support system there? So sometimes it will be a case of let's try and minimize any decrease, and they'll only be up there for a limited period of time. So it shouldn't be a major issue. But there's all those factors that do come into play when you start thinking about being in those environments. It's exactly the same I mentioned earlier about submariners. If you're staying submerged for an extended period of time and you're on silent running, you're not going to be going and doing any exercise because you're going to start making a load of noise. One of my friends works on submarines or has done in the past, and they've got a great setup on some of the bigger submarines in terms of the ability to do exercise, but it all creates vibration. And if someone's listening to you on a sonar, you're in trouble. If you're on the space station and you create vibration, is that going to damage the structure of the space station? Will that affect its orbit? So you've got all these different things that you have to factor in. So sometimes it's a case of let's just try and maintain or minimize that deterioration. And then there will be periods of time when you go, right, now we can chase after it. But again, if you think about that in the context of sport, in the middle of a competitive season, if you're competing regularly, you'll say, okay, at the moment, we probably need to maintain because we need to recover so we can perform optimally. Now we've got a period of time where there's less competition or less demanding competition because of who we're playing against. Now we can push them harder and try and get some adaptation.
I wonder if there's any, I don't know if this lends any support to some sort of a myostatin inhibitor for people who are going on the space station. Because I was speaking with a medical doctor the other day, and I was talking with him about the different GLP-1 agonists, and like they're getting even better with helping you lose weight, very decreased side effects. But one of the big side effects is decrease in muscle mass. And for a lot of people who are on GLP-1 agonists, they're not typically eating all that healthy or not really resistance training. And like the Ozempic or tirzepatide or whatever they're on, induced sarcopenia becomes an issue of its own. Can they produce a myostatin inhibitor to just decrease the accretion of, the muscle protein breakdown? He says they're working on that. And that's one of those things too, I think about, like, what about just testosterone replacement therapy or something like at a very low dose for astronauts, just to maintain some semblance of muscle in a way that's like healthful and not more damaging
Yeah.
than it would otherwise be.
Yeah, that's definitely something I think, at the moment should be considered. The average age of an astronaut going into space is around about 45. There are a few that are younger. There are a few that are a lot older. People in their late 50s and 60s still going into space. So in that point, you're on that downward decline at that point. So
You start at the age of 30.
yeah, so you've got to start thinking then, well, would some of those therapies be beneficial? Is there the evidence to show that they are as detrimental to health as people think? Well, maybe at those very high supraphysiological doses where when you're not doing aerobic exercise, you're just trying to bulk up and get as big as possible, and you're eating a poor diet, there's going to be a huge amount of side effects. But again, it's when you've got to look holistically then. How does that affect other systems in the body? If we offset that decrease in muscle mass and maybe decrease in bone mineral density, does it have a negative effect elsewhere, cardiovascular system, etc.? But there's things there that they need to be looked at. Or could you then medicate them if they come back and you've lost a certain amount of bone mineral density or a certain amount of bone mineral or certain amount of muscle mass? Would some type of drug therapy be useful to get you back up to a closer to a normal level quickly? That's not my area of expertise, but I'm pretty certain there will be things there that could be used that probably haven't been explored or exploited to the extent that they could do. It's going to be, I think, as more and more people go to space, as I've said, we'll get a lot more data. The age of astronauts, if you look at a lot of people, astronauts in training now, the age is coming down and down. A lot of them used to be people that had been, they've been a medic, or they've been in the military, they've been a pilot and then a test pilot. Most astronauts in the past had really successful, amazing careers as engineers or in the military or medics, scientists, etc. Now some people are going, oh, actually, I could become an astronaut, and that's their goal. Don't think, going back 20 years, anyone ever thought that was a goal, because there were so few people going into space. So it will maybe a little bit easier with people being younger who might see less of a deterioration. But actually then, if people go up and do very long duration missions, you might be younger when you go up, but the Mars and back, if that's going to take 3 years, maybe longer, how many missions could you do in your lifetime? So people will want to extend it and go for longer if that's the career they really want. So yeah, I think there's going to be a huge amount of developments, as you've just alluded to, in terms of drug therapies for a whole range of different things. But again, it's then just, well, what are the potential side effects you might get from those drugs? Will that exacerbate the condition while you're in space? Does that create other things which could be problematic? And, I think it'll be really a case of let's see how everything progressive over time. But I do think that a lot of the basic issues they're finding physiologically at the moment is just progressive overload. It really is that simple. It doesn't seem to matter whether we're working with older individuals, whether we're working with athletes, military populations that we've been doing some work with, whether it's looking at the data from the astronauts. If we apply the appropriate principles of training to people and create progressive overload, it seems to be the most effective way. And Delorme knew that back in the 1930s and 40s. I'm not quite sure what's happened since then, but people don't seem to be following those basic principles.
It's funny. It's like almost there's so many like influencers and YouTubers and all this different stuff on like, oh, this is the best ab exercise, how to get big, how to get strong. And it goes back to that very that first definition that you talk about, like day one of exercise physiology, like junior year in college, progressive overload, just doing a little bit more than yesterday. And it comes down to that.
And I think that's why most of those things work. Like you said, you listen to these different influencers and, this is the best thing, this is the best thing, this is the best thing. And if you look, they all work. And they've all applied progressive overload. No one's compared to see which one of those methods is the best, but they all work if you apply progressive overload to them. And you're dedicated, you do it consistently, you eat a decent diet. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it just has to be appropriate for the type of exercise you're doing. And I think that's the thing that people don't grasp. If you think about bodybuilding, they used to fall in the camp of, the really high intensity Mike Mentzer style training, or it would be the stuff that Arnold Schwarzenegger would do, where it was, hours and hours per day, sometimes twice per day. They both work, but they're creating a stimulus in a totally different way. What would be really interesting is you have people flipping almost, they do the one type really high volume training for a period of time. You can't keep pushing the volumes all the time. Then you give yourself a 6-8 week period of that really high intensity training. You can't keep pushing that all the time because you'll get injured. Then go back, cycle between those approaches. What would happen then? That's always intrigued me to know whether if you get really strong, suddenly you go back to doing hypertrophy training, and then you can lift a lot more weight. So your volume's already gone up because you're now stronger. But then you put on more muscle mass, so you have the potential to increase strength dramatically because you've got a greater cross-sectional area. If we just rotate between those two, would that be even more beneficial than saying, no, we do it this way or we do it this way? But I'm not aware of any competitive bodybuilder that's tried that approach.
Yeah, and then like the caveat of like the drug-induced stimulus as well. But I mean, that yeah, I think that lends support to the future of research as we would all love to see. And I think like that's what you have your hands totally in right now with regard for space research, of like there's so many variables that we can talk about, and there's hopefully research and different teams looking at those different things so we can keep on that collective goal of getting to where we want to go. But it's not easy by any means. But I'm really excited to have these conversations over the next 10, 20 years and be like, holy crap, remember when we were talking about this one little thing and now we solved it. Now we're going to Venus or something.
Yeah. The thing is that there'll be things like that where certain things will go, wow, yeah, we were correct. That worked. That was great. And other things will go, oh, we oversimplified it or we overcomplicated it. We didn't think about X. Now we've realized that that's also something we need to consider. And that's the really good thing about any aspect of science, whether it's sports science, whether it's engineering, whatever it might be, is you try and do your best to disprove a theory. And then you come up with some findings, and you think about every publication you read. At the end of that journal article, it will give you the limitations and areas of future research. So you've answered 1 or 2 research questions. And at the end, there's normally a list of 4 or 5. And then you go away and you do some more and you do more. And slowly things develop and evolve. Although you do find that those things do go in cycles. Like I said, you think about that research DeLorme was doing, what would that be now? 80 years ago? And people still don't fully understand and apply those principles. Look at the medical research where they say they're doing resistance training and there's no progressive overload. It's the same exercise band resistance they're still doing in whatever medical situation, no progressive overload. So they improve for the first 4 to 6 weeks and then they plateau. They plateau, what do? They stop performing the exercise and then they slowly return back to where they were previously. Just apply progressive overload, it'll work. But you do see it going in cycles regularly.
Dr. Comfort, this was awesome. Thank you for coming on today and talking mainly about space. This is like a huge passion of mine. I think that between you and Dan, it was just like this incredible web of thoughts and ideas and just ever expanding research. So really, thank you for coming on and talking about this today.
No problem. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And it's nice to follow on after Dan as well, when you could see straight away your passion to ask more questions about those areas was brilliant. But it really does draw parallels across so many different areas, which keeps it really exciting.
Yeah, where do you post anything? Can people follow along with what you're doing and everything?
Yeah, I'm on X as it is now and Instagram. I don't post anywhere near as often as I should do. It's at Paul Comfort 1975. Which gives away my age. So, yeah, people can follow me there or just search on ResearchGate, and you can find all the research that I've been publishing over the last 20-ish years.
Awesome. I'll link it all below.
Awesome.